"You're in the wrong room, darling," one lieutenant snickered as I stepped into the Top Gun briefing. "Real pilots only. Secretaries wait outside." Laughter broke out. Then the instructor entered, looked straight at me, and saluted. "Welcome back, Phoenix 1. Every jaw dropped, faces drained of color. Imagine walking into a room full of arrogant young pilots about to lead one of the most elite flight training programs in the world, only to have a junior lieutenant tell you, "You're in the wrong room, sweetheart. Real pilots only." The insult hit me hard, but what happened next? Well, that's when things got really interesting. I'm Commander Elise Rogers, and at 38 years old, I earned my wings the hard way. I'm talking about surviving a cockpit fire at 30,000 feet and still bringing the jet home. 4 years, I gave everything to the Navy, my time, my health, my peace. Training younger pilots, covering for their mistakes, proving over and over that I belonged in a world that didn't always want me to. But that day, walking into that Top Gun briefing, something in me just shifted. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just waited. And then the instructor saluted me and called me Phoenix 1. Have you ever been underestimated so completely that proving them wrong wasn't even satisfying, just inevitable? If you've ever had to stand your ground and let your actions do the talking, you'll understand this. It was a Tuesday, 1,400 hours, and the Nevada sun was bleaching the tarmac white outside. Inside, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the heat. I walked into briefing room 7 in my standard Navy flight khakis, sleeves rolled just so, hair pulled back tight. No name tape yet on this uniform. They'd issued it that morning. I carried my tablet and a coffee, the kind of strong, bitter stuff you learn to drink black after enough years at sea. The room was already half full. Young faces, confident postures, flight suits unzipped just enough to show t-shirts underneath. All men. They stood in clusters near the front, talking in that particular way fighter pilots talk, hands tracing imaginary maneuvers, voices pitched just loud enough to make sure everyone could hear how good they were. I recognized the type immediately. I'd flown with versions of them for 15 years. I took a seat in the back row, set my coffee down, and opened my tablet. Behind me, someone muttered something I couldn't quite catch. Lo, brief laughter followed. I didn't turn around. There was a time, early in my career, when I would have needed to know exactly what they were saying, felt compelled to respond, to defend, to prove something. But I'd learned that the best response to men who underestimate you is to let them keep doing it, until the moment it costs them something. The briefing was supposed to start at 14:30. At 14:28, a lieutenant with dark hair and wireframe glasses walked past my row, stopped, and then backtracked. He had his helmet bag slung over one shoulder and a call sign patch I couldn't read stitched onto his flight suit. He looked at me, then at the room number on the wall, then back at me. "You're in the wrong room, sweetheart," he said. His tone wasn't quite hostile, just confidently corrective, the way you'd redirect someone who'd gotten lost looking for the bathroom. "Real pilots only. Secretaries sit outside." The conversations around us died. Heads turned. I looked up at him, letting a beat of silence stretch out, just long enough to be noticeable. I was about to speak when the door at the front of the room opened. Captain David Walker entered, the way he always did, shoulders back, eyes scanning the room. In one efficient sweep, the kind of situational awareness you can't teach, only have. He was older than the last time I'd seen him, grayer at the temples, but he carried himself with the same unshakable calm that had kept our squadron alive over the Persian Gulf when I was 27 and everything was on fire. He stopped mid-stride when his eyes found me. His entire posture changed, not relaxed, but sharp, formal. He came to attention and saluted. "Good to have you back, Phoenix 1, he said. His voice carried across the room like a blade. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. I returned the salute, crisp and deliberate, the way he taught me a decade ago when I was a nugget pilot who didn't know how to land on a carrier deck in a crosswind. Every man in that room had gone still. The lieutenant who'd called me sweetheart had backed up 2 steps, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something close to panic. "Good to be back, sir," I said. Captain Walker moved to the front of the room and set his briefing materials on the podium. "Gentlemen," he said, and I noticed he didn't look at them, just started queuing up slides. "Let me introduce Commander Elise Rogers. Some of you may know her call sign, Phoenix 1. She earned it during Operation Enduring Freedom after her F/A-18 took battle damage during a strike package over Kandahar. Hydraulic failure, electrical fire, and she still put her ordnance on target before recovering to the carrier. She later commanded VFA-41, the Black Aces, through 2 deployments. She holds the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal with Valor device. She's here as a candidate evaluator for this selection cycle. He finally looked up. And she's senior to every person in this room except me. I watched their faces. Some tried to hide their reactions. Others didn't bother. The lieutenant, his name tape read Cruz, had gone pale. Another pilot, younger, with red hair and freckles, stared at his boots. A third, sitting near the front, met my eyes for half a second, then looked away. I understood what was happening in their heads. They were recalculating, running through everything they'd said in the past 20 minutes, wondering if I'd heard, wondering what it would cost them. Captain Walker started the briefing. It was technical, focused, the usual rundown of training objectives and evaluation criteria for the Naval Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, though nobody called it that officially anymore. I took notes on my tablet, asked 2 clarifying questions about the syllabus timeline, and stayed quiet otherwise. When Walker dismissed the group, the pilots filed out in silence. Cruz lingered near the door like he wanted to say something, but I didn't give him the opening. I gathered my materials and walked to the front of the room. You didn't have to do that, I told Walker when we were alone. Do what? The introduction. They would have figured it out eventually. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Eventually isn't the same as immediately. And you've outdrank most of the instructors here, too. They needed to know. I don't need you to fight my battles, David. I'm not fighting your battles. I'm preventing a bunch of junior officers from ending their careers before they start. He closed his laptop and looked at me straight on. You've been gone 3 years. Things haven't changed as much as they should have. He was right. I'd been stationed overseas, flying missions out of bases where rank mattered more than gender because everyone was too tired and too busy to care about anything except getting home alive. Coming back stateside was like stepping backward in time. How long are you here? He asked. 6 months. Maybe longer, depending on the assignment after this. You thinking about staying in past 20? I don't know yet. I picked up my coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. Depends on whether I still like the job when I'm not dodging surface-to-air missiles. He laughed at that. A short bark of sound. Fair enough. Listen, Rogers, Elise. I'm glad you're here. We need people like you in the schoolhouse. People who've actually done the job under fire. You mean women? I mean pilots who know what the hell they're doing and can teach these kids how not to die. He paused. But yeah, women too. It matters that they see you here, whether they know it yet or not. I left the building 20 minutes later and walked back across the base toward the bachelor officers' quarters. The sun was lower now, the air still hot but losing its edge. I passed the flight line. Rows of F divided by a -18s parked on the ramp, wings folded, canopies glinting. I'd spent half my adult life in airplanes like those. Strapped into an ejection seat, helmet on, the ocean 5 miles below. It was the only place I'd ever felt completely sure of myself, completely free of doubt. On the ground, everything was complicated. In the air, it was simple. Fly the aircraft, complete the mission, bring everyone home. I thought about Cruz and his comment, "Secretary, sit outside," and felt nothing. Not anger, not vindication, not even satisfaction, just a kind of tired familiarity. I'd heard versions of that line 100 times over the years. You get used to it or you don't. And if you don't, you leave. I'd stayed because I was good at the job and because leaving would have meant letting people like him win by default. But some days I wondered what it would have been like to choose a career where competence was assumed instead of constantly tested. My phone buzzed. A text from Walker. Drinks later if you want to catch up properly. I sent back a thumbs-up emoji and kept walking. The air smelled like jet fuel and dust, familiar and clean in a way that made sense to me. Somewhere behind me, an aircraft engine spooled up for a test run, the sound rising and falling like breathing. I'd be back in a cockpit in 2 days for my requalification flights. Until then, I had paperwork, briefs, and a room full of young pilots who were just beginning to understand that the person they'd underestimated was about to evaluate whether they were good enough to be here at all. I joined the Navy at 19 because I didn't know what else to do, and because my father, a Marine, had told me the military would give me structure, purpose, and a way to pay for college. He was right about two of those three things. I enlisted as an aviation electronics technician, E3, and spent 2 years on a carrier turning wrenches on radar systems, learning how aircraft actually worked from the inside out. I was good with my hands, good with circuits and schematics. I liked the work, but I spent those 2 years watching pilots walk past me on the flight deck. And something in me wanted that. The freedom of it, the complexity, the fact that everyone looked at them differently. So, I applied to officer candidate school. It took me 2 tries. The first time, they told me my test scores were fine, but they weren't sure I had the leadership presence they were looking for, which was code for something I didn't want to decode. The second time, I scored higher, ran faster, and made sure I was impossible to ignore. They accepted me. I was 21. Flight school was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Not because I wasn't capable, but because I was always half a step behind in the informal knowledge, the unspoken rules, the camaraderie that formed naturally among the men in my class and seemed to require extra effort for me to access. I studied twice as long, flew every extra hop I could get, and kept my mouth shut when the jokes got uncomfortable. I earned my wings at 25 and got assigned to a fleet squadron, VFA 105, the Gunslingers, flying F/A-18 Hornets off the USS Harry S. Truman. My first cruise was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I learned how to land on a carrier deck at night in bad weather, how to refuel from a tanker at 20,000 feet, how to put a bomb on target from a dive angle that made your vision gray at the edges. I also learned how to be the only woman in a ready room full of men who didn't quite know what to do with me. Some ignored me. Some went out of their way to help. A few made it clear they thought I didn't belong there and never would. I stopped caring which category anyone fell into and focused on being better than all of them. The call sign came during my second deployment. We were flying strikes into Afghanistan. Close air support for troops in contact. The kind of missions where you're on station for hours and then everything happens in 90 seconds. I took a hit from ground fire, small arms, a lucky shot that punctured a hydraulic line and started an electrical fire in the cockpit. The controls went sluggish, alarms screaming, smoke filling the space around me. I had ordnance still loaded, a target still marked, and a forward air controller on the radio telling me they needed that bomb right now or people were going to die. So I put it on target. I rolled in, pickled the GBU, pulled off, and flew the dying aircraft back to the carrier with one good hydraulic system and half my electrical panel dark. I trapped on the third wire, shut down the engine, and climbed out to find the deck crew staring at me like I'd grown a second head. The fire had burned through part of the cockpit paneling. The maintenance chief told me later that if I'd stayed airborne another 10 minutes, the flight control computer would have failed completely, and I'd have had to eject over the ocean. Captain Walker, who was my squadron commanding officer then, called me into a stateroom that night. He poured me a bourbon, which was technically against regulations underway, but which no one was going to mention, and said, "That was either the gutsiest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen." "Both, sir," I told him. He laughed. "Fair assessment. You know what a phoenix is? A bird that rises from fire. Yeah, that's you now. Phoenix 1. He raised his glass. "Welcome to the fraternity, Rogers." The call sign stuck. Within a week, everyone on the ship knew the story, half of them exaggerated, but the core of it true. I became the pilot who'd flown a burning jet back to the boat and landed it like it was a routine day. The respect that followed wasn't universal, but it was real. People stopped questioning whether I could handle the job. They started asking me for advice instead. I made lieutenant commander at 32 and got my own division to lead. At 35, I fleeted up to command VFA 41, the Black Aces, one of the oldest and most decorated squadrons in the Navy. I took them through 2 deployments, one to the Western Pacific, one to the Persian Gulf, and brought everyone home alive both times. That's the metric that matters in naval aviation. Did everyone come back? Everything else is secondary. I earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for a mission over Yemen, where I led a strike package through heavy anti-aircraft fire to take out a weapons cache that intelligence said was being used to supply insurgents. We took fire going in and coming out. One of my pilots got hit, lost his radio, and I talked him back to the tanker using hand signals through the canopy, then escorted him 300 miles to the carrier because his navigation system was fried. The Air Medal with Valor came from a different mission, a different war. Details I don't talk about much, because some of it is still classified, and some of it I just don't want to remember. Walker stayed in touch through all of it. He made captain, got assigned to Top Gun as an instructor, and eventually became the officer in charge of curriculum development. When my squadron command tour ended, and I was due for a new assignment, he called me and asked if I wanted to come to Fallon, teach the next generation, help shape the program. I said yes because I trusted him, and because I was tired of deploying, and because part of me wanted to see if I could still do the job without the adrenaline. I arrived at Naval Air Station Fallon on a Monday in late September, checked into the bachelor officers' quarters, and spent the first week reading through training materials and requalifying in the aircraft. The base felt different from a carrier, more permanent, less transient, but the flight lines smelled the same, sounded the same. I flew 3 hops that week, each one sharper than the last. My hands remembering the controls like muscle memory that had never faded. It was on the second week, during that briefing in Room 7, that I realized how much the job had changed and how much it hadn't. The young pilots in that room weren't worse than the ones I'd flown with 15 years ago. They were just the same, confident, skilled, and in some cases blind to their own assumptions. I didn't blame Cruz for what he'd said. He didn't know who I was, but I also didn't excuse it because ignorance isn't the same thing as innocence. And at some point, you're responsible for what you don't know. That night, I met Walker for drinks at a bar off base, a quiet place with dim lighting and a jukebox playing old country music. We sat in a booth near the back and talked about the people we used to fly with, the ones who'd stayed in and the ones who'd gotten out, the ones who hadn't made it home. He told me about his kids, 2 daughters, both in college now, and I told him about my mother, who'd remarried after my father died and moved to Arizona, where she sent me pictures of sunsets and asked when I was going to settle down. "You ever think about getting out?" Walker asked at one point. "Every day," I said. "And then I go flying, and I forget why I wanted to leave. That's the trap, isn't it?" "Yeah." I finished my beer and set the bottle down. "It is." The word spread faster than I expected. By the next morning, everyone on base seemed to know who I was. I walked into the operations building at 0700, and the senior chief at the desk stood up and greeted me by rank and name. In the hallway, a group of junior officers stepped aside to let me pass, one of them nodding with a tight, respectful expression. At the flight line, the crew chief working on my assigned aircraft, a chief petty officer named Marcus Hale, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, saluted and said, "Honored to have you flying my bird, ma'am." I stopped, surprised. "You know who I am?" "Everyone knows who you are, Commander Phoenix One. We read about you in the maintenance logs from Truman. That fire you brought back. We used that as a case study for damage assessment training." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and said, "Let's make sure this one doesn't catch fire." He grinned. "Roger that, ma'am." The pilots were harder to read. Some avoided me entirely, changing direction in the hallway, or suddenly finding something fascinating to look at when I entered a room. Others made a point of introducing themselves, shaking my hand, welcoming me to the team with a formality that felt almost defensive, like they were trying to prove they weren't like the others. A few, mostly the older instructors, the ones who'd been around long enough to see the culture shift slowly over decades, treated me exactly the way they treated everyone else, which was the only reaction I actually wanted. Cruz, the lieutenant who told me secretaries sit outside, didn't approach me for 3 days. On the 4th day, I saw him in the hangar inspecting his aircraft before a training flight. I was walking past with my helmet bag, heading to my own jet, and he caught sight of me and froze. For a second, I thought he was going to pretend he hadn't seen me. Then he set down his checklist and walked over. "Commander Rogers," he said. His voice was steady, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "I owe you an apology." I stopped walking. "Go ahead." What I said in the briefing room was out of line. "I didn't know who you were, but that's not an excuse. I made an assumption based on," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, based on things that had nothing to do with your qualifications or your presence there. It was disrespectful and unprofessional. I'm sorry. I studied him for a moment. He met my eyes, didn't look away. That counted for something. Apology accepted, I said. But understand this, Lieutenant. The problem wasn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem was that you assumed someone didn't belong based on how they looked. That's the part you need to fix. Yes, ma'am. Are you a good pilot? The question seemed to catch him off guard. Yes, ma'am. I think so. Then prove it in the air. That's where it matters. I walked away before he could respond. I didn't need his gratitude or his further apologies. I needed him to be better, and words weren't going to accomplish that. Only performance would. The simulator hop happened on a Friday afternoon. The scenario was a basic tactical intercept. 2 fighters against 4 adversaries, low altitude, compressed timeline. I volunteered to fly as the lead, which meant I'd be running the tactical decisions and coordinating the engagement while my wingman executed my directions. Cruz was assigned as my wingman. I didn't ask if that was intentional. I didn't care. We briefed for 30 minutes before stepping to the simulator. I kept it straightforward. Roles, responsibilities, communication protocols, decision-making authorities. Cruz took notes, asked 2 good questions about targeting priorities, and stayed professional. In the simulator, he was slower than I expected. Not incompetent. His hands knew the aircraft, his radar work was solid. But he was thinking too much, second-guessing his instincts, trying to fly perfectly instead of effectively. I called the initial merge, directed him to take the trailing bandit while I engaged the lead. He acknowledged, maneuvered into position, but hesitated on the trigger. By the time he fired, his target had defensive advantages, and he ended up in a protracted engagement that burned fuel and time. I took my target, switched to support him, and ended up killing his bandit for him because he'd lost the initiative. We reset, ran it again. Same result. 3rd time, I let him fail completely. Didn't bail him out. Just watched his simulated aircraft get shot down while I handled the other 3 bandits alone. When we debriefed afterward, I kept my voice level and factual. You're overthinking, I said. You've got the skills, but you're not trusting them. You're flying like you're afraid to make a mistake. I am afraid to make a mistake, he said. Especially now. Especially with you. Why? He looked uncomfortable. Because of who you are. Your reputation. I don't want to look incompetent. Then stop trying not to look incompetent and start trying to be good. There's a difference. I leaned back in my chair. When you're in a merge, you don't have time to think about how you look. You have time to decide, execute, and adapt. That's it. Everything else is noise. How do you turn off the noise? You don't. You just get louder than it is. I stood up. We're flying again on Monday. Same scenario. This time, I want you to make decisions fast and live with the consequences. I'd rather see you fail decisively than succeed hesitantly. He nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. On Monday, he was better. Not perfect. He still hesitated once, still second-guessed a targeting call, but he was faster, sharper, more aggressive. When I directed him to engage, he committed fully, drove his bandit defensive, and killed him clean. We won the scenario with fuel to spare. In the debrief, I told him he'd done well, pointed out 2 mistakes he needed to correct, and moved on. He looked relieved, like he'd been holding his breath for 3 days. After that, something shifted, not just with Cruz, but with the other pilots in the training program. They started asking me questions, technical ones about weapons employment, tactical ones about decision-making under pressure. In the ready room, they stopped going quiet when I walked in. On the flight line, they treated me like what I was, an experienced pilot who'd done the job and lived to teach it. I didn't soften my feedback. I didn't lower my standards or make exceptions. When someone flew poorly, I told them. When someone made a dangerous decision, I explained why it would get them killed in combat. But I also recognized good work when I saw it, and I made a point of telling them when they'd done something right. Respect in aviation is earned through consistency, confidence, and fairness. You can't fake any of those things, and you can't demand them. You just have to be worth following. By the end of the 2nd month, Cruz had improved significantly. He was flying with confidence, making decisions faster, and his tactical awareness had sharpened to the point where he was competitive with the top pilots in his class. In a brief after one particularly challenging sortie, he stayed behind after the others left. "Commander," he said, "I wanted to thank you for not giving up on me after the way I started." "I didn't do you any favors, Lieutenant. You did the work. Still, it means something." He hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. How do you deal with it? The people who don't take you seriously? The ones who assume you're not as good because you're different?" I thought about that for a moment. "I don't deal with them," I said. "I outlast them. I outfly them. And eventually, they either figure it out or they wash out. Either way, it's not my problem to solve. It's theirs." He nodded, processing that. "That sounds lonely." "It is," I said. "But being good at something difficult is always lonely. That's not unique to me." I picked up my notes and headed for the door. Then I stopped and turned back. "Cruz, you asked how I deal with people who underestimate me. Here's the real answer. I stopped caring what they think and started caring whether I'm right. When you're in the cockpit, nobody's opinion matters except yours and your wingman's. Everything else is just static. Learn to tune it out." "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. I left him there and walked back across the base. The sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and red. Somewhere overhead, a pair of F divided by a -18S made their approach to the runway, their engines roaring in the distance. I watched them land one after the other, precise and controlled. It reminded me why I'd stayed in this job for so long. Not because it was easy or because people always respected me or because I never felt alone. But because when you're flying at 500 knots with a wingman beside you and a mission in front of you, none of that matters. You're just a pilot doing a job, and sometimes that's enough. 3 months into my assignment at Fallon, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in years. A sense of normalcy. Not comfort, exactly. This job was never comfortable, but a rhythm, a pattern to the days that made sense. Morning briefs at 0800, simulator hops before lunch, flight ops in the afternoon, debriefs until 1700 or later. I ate dinner at the officers' club, or cooked simple meals in my temporary quarters. Pasta, grilled chicken, salads from a bag. I called my mother once a week and listened to her talk about her book club and her garden. I exchanged emails with old squadron mates, the ones scattered across the fleet, some still flying and others transitioning to staff jobs or civilian life. Walker and I fell into a routine of meeting for coffee on Friday mornings before the weekend training schedule kicked in. We'd sit in his office, door closed, and talk through the week's challenges, which students were progressing, which ones were struggling, what adjustments needed to be made to the syllabus. He valued my input in a way that felt genuine, not performative. When I disagreed with him, he listened. When I was wrong, he explained why, without condescension. It reminded me why I'd always respected him, even back when I was a junior officer and he was the commanding officer who terrified everyone. One Friday, he asked me how I was really doing. Not professionally, he could see that for himself. Personally, "I'm fine," I said automatically. That's not what I asked. I set my coffee down and looked out the window at the flight line. "I don't know how to answer that question anymore, David. I've been doing this job for 15 years. I don't know who I am when I'm not doing it. That's not uncommon. I know, but it feels like it should be." I turned back to him. "I see these young pilots, Cruz, more the others, and they have lives outside the squadron. Relationships, hobbies, plans for after they get out. I don't have any of that. I have this job and a handful of people I used to deploy with who I barely talk to anymore." "Do you regret it?" "No, but I wonder sometimes what it cost me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what the hardest part of this job is? It's not the flying. It's not the danger. It's the fact that you give everything to it, and at the end, it just moves on without you. You retire or you transfer, and a week later, someone else is sitting in your seat, and the squadron keeps going like you were never there. That's bleak. It's honest." He leaned back in his chair. "But here's the other side of it. The pilots you train, the ones you teach how to survive, they carry you with them. Maybe they don't remember your name in 20 years, but they remember what you taught them. And if that saves their life or their wingman's life, then it mattered. You mattered." I didn't have a response to that. It felt true and inadequate at the same time. Like most truths about military service, Lieutenant Erin Moore was the only other woman in the training cycle. She was an F/A 18 pilot from VFA 25, quiet and competent, the kind of officer who did her job well without needing recognition for it. We'd exchanged polite greetings in the hallway a few times, but hadn't really talked until one afternoon when she knocked on my office door and asked if I had a few minutes. "Of course," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "What's on your mind?" She sat down, looked at her hands for a moment, then met my eyes. "I wanted to ask your advice about how to handle something." "Go ahead. There's an instructor here, I won't say who's been making comments. Nothing overly hostile, just small things. Jokes about women pilots, suggestions that I'm only here because of diversity quotas, comments about my appearance when I'm in my flight suit. It's not constant, but it's enough that I'm always aware of it." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. "Have you documented it?" "No. I don't know if I should. I don't want to be the woman who can't take a joke. I don't want to make it into a bigger thing than it is. Moore, listen to me. If someone is making you uncomfortable, that's already a big thing. You're not overreacting by acknowledging it. But what if I report it and nothing happens? Or worse, what if it makes me a target? I've seen how that goes. The woman who complains gets labeled difficult, emotional, unable to handle the culture. I wanted to tell her she was wrong. I wanted to promise her that if she reported it, the system would protect her, that the instructor would be held accountable, that it would all work out fairly. But I'd been in the Navy long enough to know that wasn't always true. "Here's what I can tell you," I said. "You have 3 options. 1. Document everything and report it through official channels. That's the right answer according to the book, and sometimes it works. 2. Handle it directly. Confront the instructor. Tell him the behavior is unacceptable and make it clear that if it continues, you will report it. 3. Ignore it and focus on flying better than everyone else, which is what I did for most of my career. Which one do you recommend?" Honestly, I don't know anymore. I used to think option 3 was the only viable choice. Now, I'm not sure that was right. I survived, but I shouldn't have had to survive. None of you should. She nodded slowly. "What would you do now? If you were in my position?" "I'd confront him directly. I'd tell him his comments are unprofessional and unwelcome, and I'd make sure there was a witness present so it couldn't be twisted later. And if it continued, I'd document and report. But that's me, at this point in my career, with this rank and this reputation. You have to make the choice that you can live with." "Thank you, ma'am," she said quietly. She left, and I sat there staring at my desk, feeling the weight of a conversation I'd had versions of a dozen times over the years. The advice I'd given her was sound, but it also felt insufficient. The fact that she had to calculate the risk of reporting harassment, had to weigh her career against her dignity, was an indictment of a system that claimed to value integrity above all else. 2 weeks later, I heard through Walker that Moore had confronted the instructor and that the behavior had stopped. I didn't ask for details. I was just glad she'd found a path forward that worked for her. In December, we flew a large force exercise. 8 aircraft, multiple target sets, complex threat environments. I led one of the divisions with crews as my wingman and 2 other pilots rounding out the flight. The brief took 90 minutes, covering everything from tanker procedures to communications protocols to abort criteria. By the time we stepped to the aircraft, everyone knew their role. The mission went better than I expected. Crews flew solid wing, stayed in position, executed every directive without hesitation. When we hit the target area and the simulated surface-to-air threats activated, he kept his composure, employed countermeasures correctly, and stayed offensive. We put all our ordnance on target, egressed clean, and recovered to base with no issues. In the debrief, I highlighted his performance as an example of disciplined execution under pressure. Afterward, as we were walking back to the operations building, he said, "Commander, can I ask you something?" "Sure. When you were flying combat, real combat, not training, were you ever scared?" I stopped walking and looked at him. "Every single time. But you didn't show it. Showing it doesn't help anyone. But yeah, I was scared. Fear is not the problem. The problem is letting it make your decisions for you." He thought about that. "How do you keep it from taking over?" "You focus on the task. You trust your training, And you remember that your wingman is depending on you to do your job the same way you're depending on them. That's bigger than fear. Did you ever lose anyone? Someone you were flying with? I didn't answer right away. The question had weight, and I wanted to give it the respect it deserved. Yes, I said finally. Twice. Both times in combat. Both times there was nothing I could have done differently. That doesn't make it easier, but it's the truth. Do you still think about them? Every day. We walked the rest of the way in silence. When we reached the building, he stopped and said, "Thank you for teaching me, ma'am. I know I didn't make it easy at first. You're doing fine, Cruz. Keep it up." That night, I sat in my quarters and pulled up old photos on my laptop. Pictures from deployments, from squadrons I'd served with, from missions I'd flown, faces I hadn't thought about in months or years. Some of them were still flying, some had gotten out, 2 of them were gone. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while, thinking about the cost of this job, the weight of carrying other people's lives in your hands every time you strapped into a cockpit. It never got lighter. You just got stronger. In late January, Cruz deployed with his squadron to the Western Pacific. I got an email from him a week after he left, brief and professional, thanking me for the training and saying he'd carry the lessons forward. I didn't reply immediately. I wasn't sure what to say, and I'd never been good at the sentimental side of mentorship. But 2 months later, I received another message, longer, this time sent from a ship-based email account with intermittent connectivity. "Commander Rogers, I wanted to write and tell you something that happened yesterday. We were flying a mission in support of a joint exercise. Details I can't share, but it was complex, high-tempo, multiple threats. At one point, my flight lead got task-saturated, started making decisions too slowly, and I had to step up and take tactical control of our section. I remembered what you told me. Make decisions fast and live with the consequences. So I did. I called the shot, repositioned our element, and we completed the objective without incident. Afterward, my flight lead thanked me, said I'd kept him from making a mistake that could have compromised the mission. And I realized that I'd finally stopped flying scared. I was flying like you taught me, trusting my training, trusting my instincts, focusing on the task instead of worrying about how I looked doing it. I know I gave you every reason not to invest time in me after what I said at that first briefing, but you did anyway. And it made the difference between me being an adequate pilot and being a good one. So, thank you, not just for the tactical instruction, but for showing me what it actually means to be professional. Respectfully, James Vector Cruz." I read the email 3 times. Then I saved it in a folder and closed my laptop. I didn't reply. There wasn't anything I needed to say that he didn't already understand. He'd done the work. He'd become the pilot he was capable of being. That was the only response that mattered. But I thought about that email for days afterward. Thought about the fact that he'd signed it respectfully. Thought about the call sign he'd earned, Vector. Thought about the moment when he'd stepped up and taken control because someone needed him to. That was what this job was supposed to produce. Pilots who could make hard decisions under pressure and live with the consequences. Not perfect people, just competent ones who understood the stakes. Walker asked me one afternoon if I'd heard from any of the students after they deployed. I mentioned Cruz's email without going into detail. "That's the part of this job people don't talk about," Walker said. "You spend months teaching them, then they leave, and you never really know if it mattered until you get a message like that. Does it make up for the rest of it? The politics, the bureaucracy, the people who still think we don't belong here? I don't know. Does it for you?" I thought about that. Ask me in 10 years. He laughed. "Fair enough." In March, I received orders for my next assignment, a staff position at the Pentagon, working on aviation readiness and training policy. It was the kind of job that meant long hours, no flying, and influence over programs that affected thousands of pilots I'd never meet. It was also the kind of job that signaled the Navy was taking me seriously as a senior officer, that they saw me as someone worth investing in for higher leadership roles. I wasn't sure how I felt about it. Part of me wanted to stay at Fallon, keep teaching, keep flying. Part of me was ready for something different, something that didn't involve strapping into an ejection seat and trusting my life to a machine. I called my mother and told her about the orders. She was thrilled. She'd always worried about me flying, had spent years picturing worst-case scenarios every time I deployed. A desk job in Washington meant I'd be safe, stable, closer to normal. "Are you happy about it?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I told her. "Ask me when I get there." I had 3 months left at Fallon. I spent them the way I'd spent the previous 6, teaching, flying, mentoring the next group of pilots who came through the program. Some of them knew who I was before they arrived. Others found out the same way crews had, through a moment of surprise, recalibration, and eventual respect. I stopped trying to predict which category people would fall into. It didn't matter. What mattered was whether they could fly, whether they could lead, whether they could handle the job when it stopped being theoretical and started being real. On my last day, Walker took me to lunch off base, the same bar where we'd had drinks 6 months earlier. We sat in the same booth and ordered the same food. And for a while we just talked about nothing. Sports, the absurdity of military bureaucracy. Then he set down his beer and said, "You made a difference here, Elise. I know it didn't always feel like it, but you did. I just did the job. That's exactly why it mattered. You didn't make it about proving a point. You made it about being good at what you do. And that's what they needed to see." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded and finished my drink. That night, I packed my belongings into my car and drove off the base for the last time. I stopped at the gate, looked back at the flight line in the rearview mirror, rows of aircraft parked under floodlights, the desert sky, dark and full of stars. I thought about all the hours I'd spent in planes like those, all the missions I'd flown, all the people I'd served with. Some of them were still out there, still flying, some had moved on to other things. Some were gone. I drove east through the night, headlights cutting through the darkness, the road stretching out ahead of me toward whatever came next. I didn't know if I'd made the right choices over the past 15 years. I didn't know if the sacrifices had been worth it, but I knew I'd done the job, done it well, and taught others to do the same. And for now, that was enough. The Pentagon was exactly as bureaucratic and exhausting as I expected. I worked in a windowless office on the 3rd floor, spent my days in meetings about training syllabi and budget allocations, and went home to a small apartment in Arlington that I barely furnished because I didn't plan to stay long. The work was important. I understood that intellectually, but it lacked the immediacy of flying, the clarity of purpose that came from strapping into a cockpit and executing a mission. I kept in touch with Walker via email. He sent me updates on the program, told me about the new students, asked my opinion on syllabus changes. I appreciated the connection, the reminder that there was still a world where people flew airplanes and worried about tactics instead of PowerPoint slides, but it also made me feel distant from the job I'd spent my entire adult life doing. 6 months into the Pentagon assignment, I received a message from the Chief of Naval Personnel's office. They wanted to discuss my future career path, potential command opportunities, timelines for promotion to captain. It was the kind of meeting that could determine the next 5 years of my life. I prepared for it the way I'd prepare for a check ride, reviewed my record, anticipated questions, made sure I knew what I wanted before I walked into the room. The meeting was professional, direct. They asked if I was interested in major command, an aircraft carrier, an air wing, a significant shore installation. I said yes, because saying no would effectively end my upward trajectory, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. They asked if I was willing to accept another staff tour before that happened. I said yes again, because that was the expected answer and because I understood how the system worked. Afterward, I walked through the Pentagon corridors and felt a strange sense of disconnection, like I was moving through someone else's life. This was the path I'd chosen, or the path that had chosen me, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a role I was playing, a script I was following because I didn't know how to write a different one. I called Walker that night from my apartment. "You ever feel like you're doing everything right, but none of it means anything anymore?" I asked. "Every day," he said. "That's why I stayed at Fallon as long as I could. Once you leave the operational world, it's all just abstractions. Important abstractions. But still, how do you deal with it?" I remind myself that someone has to do this job, and it might as well be someone who actually understands what the fleet needs. That helps sometimes. Other times, I just drink bourbon and watch baseball. I laughed. The first genuine laugh I'd had in weeks. "That's your professional advice?" "That's my honest advice. The professional version is, you find meaning where you can, and you trust that the work matters even when it doesn't feel like it does." That's bleak. It's the military, Elise. We don't do this job because it's easy or because it always feels meaningful. We do it because it has to be done. I sat with that for a while after we hung up. He wasn't wrong. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that I'd given so much to this career, years, relationships, parts of myself I couldn't get back. And I wasn't sure what I'd gotten in return. Rank, respect, a call sign that people recognized. But also loneliness, exhaustion, and a growing sense that I'd optimized my life for a mission that might not ever feel complete. In November, 18 months after I'd left Fallon, I received a message from the Bureau of Naval Personnel. I'd been selected for Major Command. Specifically, I was being assigned as the commanding officer of Naval Air Station Oceana, one of the largest naval air stations on the East Coast, home to multiple fighter squadrons and thousands of personnel. It was a significant assignment, the kind that would position me for promotion to captain and potentially flag rank. After that, I should have been excited. This was what I'd been working toward my entire career. The opportunity to lead at scale, to shape policy and culture, to make decisions that would affect hundreds of pilots and thousands of support personnel. But when I read the message, all I felt was tired. I accepted the assignment because that was what you did. You didn't turn down Major Command unless you were ready to retire, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Or maybe I was, and I just didn't know how to admit it. Before I transferred to Oceana, I took 2 weeks of leave and flew to Arizona to visit my mother. She was 70 now, still sharp and active, living in a retirement community where she played tennis and volunteered at the library. We spent the days hiking in the desert, cooking dinners together, talking about everything except the Navy. It was the most relaxed I'd felt in years. One evening, sitting on her back patio watching the sunset, she asked me if I was happy. "I'm successful," I said. "That's not what I asked." I didn't answer right away. The sky was turning purple and orange, the air cooling as the sun dropped below the horizon. "I don't know, Mom. I've spent my whole life trying to be good at this job, and I am good at it. But I'm not sure that's the same thing as being happy." "Then why do you keep doing it?" "Because it's what I know. Because I've invested too much to walk away now. Because I don't know who I am if I'm not doing this." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your father used to say something similar. He loved the Marines, gave them everything he had, but at the end, he wished he'd spent more time with us. Wished he'd made different choices. I don't want that for you, Elise. I want you to have a life outside of all this." "I have a life. Do you? Or do you have a career that takes up all the space where a life should be?" I didn't have an answer to that. We sat in silence and watched the stars come out, and I thought about all the things I'd sacrificed without really choosing to: relationships, stability, the possibility of something beyond the Navy. I told myself it was worth it, that the mission mattered more than personal comfort. But sitting there with my mother, I wasn't sure anymore. I took command of Naval Air Station Oceana in January, 2 years after I'd left Fallon. The change of command ceremony was formal and precise: speeches, salutes, the passing of the organizational flag from the outgoing commander to me. I stood in front of hundreds of personnel and swore to execute the duties of my office to the best of my ability, to lead with integrity and confidence, to uphold the standards of the United States Navy. Afterward, people congratulated me, shook my hand, welcomed me to the team. I smiled and thanked them, and tried to feel something other than the weight of responsibility settling onto my shoulders. The job was consuming. I worked 12-hour days, sometimes longer, managing operations, personnel issues, budgets, maintenance schedules, community relations. I attended meetings with local officials, briefed senior officers on readiness, reviewed incident reports, made decisions that affected thousands of people. It was important work, necessary work, but it was also relentless. I flew occasionally in certain flights, proficiency hops, but it wasn't the same. I was the commanding officer now, which meant I was always thinking about risk management, liability, appearances. The freedom I'd felt as a younger pilot, the pure joy of flight, had been replaced by caution and calculation. 6 months into the assignment, I received news that Captain David Walker had retired. I'd known it was coming. He'd hit his 30 years, and he told me months earlier that he was ready to be done. But seeing the official message still hit me harder than I expected. He'd been a constant presence in my career, a mentor and friend who'd understood this life in a way few others did. Now he was gone, transitioned to civilian life, and I was still here, still grinding through the job. I sent him an email congratulating him and asking what his plans were. He replied a week later. He'd taken a job as a flight instructor at a civilian aviation school in Colorado, teaching people to fly small aircraft for fun. The message was brief, but I could sense the contentment in it, the relief of stepping away from the bureaucracy and getting back to the simple act of flying. I was happy for him. I was also envious, in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. The email came on a Tuesday in September, almost 3 years after I'd left Fallon. The subject line read, "Request for guest lecture, Top Gun." I opened it, curious. "Commander Rogers, we're hosting a leadership symposium at the Naval Fighter Weapons School next month, and we'd like to invite you as a guest speaker. The topic is leading in high-performance environments, and we're specifically looking for senior officers who can speak to the challenges of balancing technical excellence with leadership responsibilities. We'd be honored if you'd consider participating. The event is October 15th, and we'd cover all travel expenses. Please let me know if you're available. Respectfully, Captain Sarah Chen, Commanding Officer, Naval Fighter Weapons School." I stared at the email for a long time. Fallon, the place where I'd spent 6 months teaching, mentoring, rediscovering what I loved about this job. The place where I'd felt like I was making a tangible difference instead of shuffling paperwork and managing bureaucracy. I accepted the invitation. I arrived at Fallon on a Thursday afternoon, 2 days before the symposium. The base looked the same. Flat desert landscape, rows of aircraft on the flight line, the mountains in the distance. I checked into the bachelor officers' quarters and spent the evening walking around, remembering what it had felt like to be here, to have a clear purpose every day. The next morning, I visited the operations building. Some of the staff recognized me, greeted me warmly. Others were new, didn't know who I was, treated me with polite formality. I ran into Chief Marcus Hale on the flight line, and his face lit up when he saw me. "Commander Rogers, good to see you, ma'am. You here for the symposium?" "I am. How have you been, Chief?" "Can't complain. Still keeping these birds flying. Heard you're running Oceana now. That's a big job." "It is. You miss flying every day?" He nodded knowingly. "That's the trade-off, isn't it? The higher you go, the further you get from the cockpit." "Yeah," I said. "It is." The symposium was held in the main auditorium, attended by about 60 pilots, current students, recent graduates, and some senior instructors. I sat through the morning sessions, listening to other speakers talk about leadership, decision-making, and organizational culture. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium, looked out at the audience, and felt a strange sense of calm. This was familiar territory. Not the speaking, that was always uncomfortable, but the audience. These were pilots, people who understood the job, who lived the same life I'd lived. I didn't have to explain myself to them. "I'm Commander Elise Rogers," I said. "Call sign Phoenix 1. Some of you might know that story. Some of you might not. Either way, I'm not here to talk about my combat record. I'm here to talk about something harder. What it means to lead when you're not sure you have anything left to give." I saw a few people sit up straighter, paying closer attention. "I've been in the Navy for 20 years, I continued. "I've flown combat missions, commanded a squadron, taught at the school, and now I run an air station. And I'm going to tell you something that nobody says at these events. Most days, I'm not sure any of it was worth it." Silence in the room. I had their full attention now. I'm not saying I regret my choices. I'm saying there's a cost to this career that nobody warns you about. You give everything to the mission. Your time, your relationships, your sense of who you are outside of this uniform. And the mission takes it, gratefully, without hesitation. And at some point, you look up and realize you've optimized your entire life for something that will replace you the moment you're gone. I paused. Let that sit. So why do we do it? Why do we keep showing up? Keep flying? Keep leading, even when it's hard and lonely and exhausting? Because someone has to. Because the mission matters, even if it doesn't always feel like it does. And because the people you fly with, the people you lead, they're worth it. They're worth the sacrifice, the exhaustion, the loneliness. I looked around the room, saw young faces, older faces, people at every stage of their careers. When I was here 3 years ago, I taught a lieutenant who made a mistake. a bad one. He underestimated me, disrespected me, and had to learn the hard way that assumptions are dangerous. But he learned, and now he's deployed, flying combat missions, and he's good at it. And that matters more than the mistake he made. That's what leadership is. Giving people the chance to be better than they were yesterday, even when they don't deserve it. I wrapped up a few minutes later, thanked them for their time, and stepped down from the podium. The applause was polite but genuine. Afterward, several pilots came up to talk to me, ask questions, share their own stories. One of them was a young woman, a lieutenant, who thanked me for being honest about the cost of the career. "It helps to know I'm not the only one who feels this way sometimes," she said. "You're not," I told her. "And that's okay. Feeling it doesn't mean you're failing. It just means you're human." On my last morning at Fallon, I requested a solo flight, a simple proficiency hop. Nothing tactical, just me and an F/A, 18 in an hour of airspace. They approved it without hesitation. I walked to the aircraft, did my pre-flight inspection, climbed into the cockpit, and strapped in. Chief Hale was there, running through the final checks, making sure everything was ready. "Good luck, ma'am," he said before climbing down. "Thanks, Chief." I started the engines, ran through the checklists, taxied to the runway. The tower cleared me for takeoff, and I advanced the throttles, felt the aircraft accelerate, felt the nose lift, felt the wheels leave the ground, and for the first time in months, I felt free. I climbed to 20,000 feet, leveled off, and flew lazy circles over the desert. No mission, no timeline, no pressure, just flight. The sky was clear, the visibility unlimited. And for 30 minutes, I didn't have to think about command or responsibility or the cost of this career. I just flew. When I landed and taxied back to the line, I shut down the engines and sat in the cockpit for a minute, helmet still on, hands resting on my thighs. I thought about Walker's email, about his decision to retire, about the contentment I'd sensed in his message. I thought about my mother's question, "Are you happy?" And I realized I didn't have a good answer. But I also realized that maybe happiness wasn't the right metric. Maybe what mattered was whether the work had meaning, whether it made a difference, whether it was worth showing up for even on the hard days. And by that measure, I was doing okay. I climbed out of the cockpit, grabbed my helmet bag, and walked back to the operations building. Tomorrow, I'd fly back to Oceania, back to the job, back to the relentless grind of command. But today, I'd done something I loved in a place that felt like home. And that was enough. 1 year later, I stood in front of a different briefing room. Same base, same building. But this time, I wasn't walking in as a student or an evaluator. The nameplate beside the door read, Commander Elise Rogers, Lead Instructor, Advanced Tactics Division, Naval Fighter Weapons School. I'd submitted my resignation from command at Oceania 6 months earlier. The conversation with the detailer had been brief, professional. They'd asked if I was sure. I'd said yes. They'd asked where I wanted to go. I'd said Fallon. There had been a pause on the other end of the line. Then we can make that happen. And they had. I wasn't running an air station anymore. I wasn't managing thousands of people, or sitting in budget meetings, or worrying about community relations. I was teaching pilots how to fly, how to fight, how to survive. It was a step backward in terms of career progression. Everyone knew that taking an instructor billet after major command meant you were off the flag officer track. But I didn't care. I was flying 3 times a week, debriefing tactics every afternoon, and going home to a small house off base where I'd finally unpacked all my boxes and hung pictures on the walls. My mother had visited last month, spent a week hiking with me in the mountains, cooking dinners in my actual kitchen. She'd looked around the house, the furniture I'd chosen, the books on the shelves, the running shoes by the door, and said, "You look different." Different how? Lighter. Like you're not carrying something heavy anymore. She was right. I'd spent 20 years carrying the weight of proving myself, of being excellent, of never giving anyone a reason to doubt I belonged. And somewhere in the past year, I'd set that weight down. Not because I'd proven anything, but because I'd stopped needing to. The door opened, and the new class filed in. 22 pilots this cycle. 2 of them women. They found their seats, opened their tablets, settled into the focused quiet that preceded every brief. I recognized the energy in the room, anticipation, confidence, the unspoken question of whether they were good enough to be here. I waited until they were all seated, then walked to the front. No introduction necessary. By now, most of them knew who I was before they arrived. Not from that first briefing 3 years ago. That story had faded into squadron lore, embellished and distorted. But from their own research, their own instructors, the reputation I'd built over 2 decades of flying. Welcome to Advanced Tactics, I said. I'm Commander Rogers. For the next 8 weeks, we're going to teach you how to think like an adversary, how to exploit weaknesses in defensive systems, and how to lead a strike package into contested airspace and bring everyone home. Some of you will struggle. Some of you will fail. That's not a threat. It's a statistical reality. This course has a 30% attrition rate, and we're not interested in lowering it. I pulled up the first slide, a tactical scenario for 4 aircraft against a layered air defense network. Let's start with a simple question, I continued. You're the mission commander. Your package is 20 miles from the target, and your electronic warfare aircraft reports a radar system that wasn't in the intelligence brief. What do you do? Hands went up. I pointed to a lieutenant in the front row, a pilot from VFA 103 with sharp eyes and a call sign stitched on his flight suit. Blade. Abort the mission, ma'am. If the threat picture doesn't match the brief, we don't have valid ROE to continue. That's one answer, I said. Anyone else? A woman in the third row raised her hand. Lieutenant junior grade. She looked young, couldn't be more than 26. Her name tape read, Santos. Adapt the plan, ma'am. Reroute around the threat. Compress the timeline and prosecute the target from a different axis. Better, I said. But you're still assuming the new radar is the only change. What if there are more surprises waiting? What if your intelligence was compromised from the start? Silence. They were thinking now, recalculating their assumptions. The right answer, I said, is that there is no right answer. There's only the decision you make with the information you have and the consequences you live with afterward. Mission command isn't about being perfect. It's about being decisive when perfect isn't an option. I ran them through the scenario, walked them through decision trees, showed them how to evaluate risk in real time. By the end of the hour, some looked energized, others looked overwhelmed. That was fine. They'd figure it out or they wouldn't. After the brief, Santos approached me. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Go ahead. How do you know when you're making the right call? When there's no clear answer and the pressure's on and people are counting on you. I looked at her, saw myself 15 years ago asking the same question to an instructor who'd probably felt just as uncertain about the answer. You don't, I said. You make the best call you can with what you know, and then you move forward. Second-guessing yourself in the moment gets people killed. Second-guessing yourself afterward is how you learn. But in the moment, you trust your training and you decide. She nodded slowly, processing that. Can I tell you something else? I added. The fact that you're asking that question means you're thinking like a leader. A lot of pilots never get there. They're so focused on being right that they freeze when there's no clear answer. Don't be that pilot. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. She left, and I gathered my materials. Through the window, I could see the flight line. Rows of F divided by a -18S, ground crews moving between them, the mountains rising in the distance under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. I'd made the right choice coming back here. Not the smart career choice, not the path to higher rank, but the right choice for me. That night, I met Walker for dinner. He'd driven down from Colorado, visiting the area for a reunion with old squadron mates. We sat at the same bar where we talked 3 years ago, ordered the same food, fell into the same comfortable rhythm of conversation. You seem good, he said after we'd covered the usual topics. I am. No regrets about leaving command. None. I did that job. It was important. But it wasn't me. This is. He smiled. I told you years ago that the best part of this job is the people you teach. Glad you figured it out. Took me long enough. We finished our drinks and said goodbye in the parking lot. He'd head back to Colorado in the morning, back to his civilian life, his simple job teaching people to fly for fun. I'd head back to base, back to the simulators and briefs and flight line. Different paths, same underlying truth. We both found a way to keep doing what we loved without letting it consume us. I drove home through the desert night, windows down, cool air rushing through the car. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat for a moment before going inside, looking up at the stars scattered across the sky. Somewhere out there, pilots I trained were flying missions, making decisions, leading others. Maybe they remembered what I taught them. Maybe they didn't. Either way, I'd done my part. Inside, I changed into comfortable clothes, made tea, sat on my couch with a book I'd been meaning to read for months. No paperwork, no urgent emails, no weight of command, just a quiet evening in a house that finally felt like home. And standing there, seeing all those eager, bright faces, I realized they used to say real pilots only. Turns out, that's exactly what I was. And I didn't need anyone's permission, or validation, or even their applause to know it anymore. It took me 20 years, a burning jet, and a journey away from, and then back to my true purpose. But I finally found peace in the cockpit and in the classroom. What about you? Have you ever had to choose between a successful path and the one that truly made you feel alive? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below.